Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad, and I am joined yet again by Dr. Shir Hever, who will be addressing part four of the series Israel's Zombie Economy. The title of today's conversation is Israel's Economy on the Verge of Collapse? We have recorded part one in studio, part two and three at Strasbourg in France in person, and I had the pleasure to meet Shir and converse live. And now we are headed to part four right before we do the conclusion pretty shortly. The first part was on the war currency. Second part was on the counter-revolution of the Israeli arms industry. The third part was on Israel's breakdown into tribes. Uh, just one thing before I introduce Shir. We are also joined by a co-sponsor, Mondowise. So it's a Jadaliyya Productions, co-sponsored by the Gaza and Context Project, and Mondowise, the fascinating publication that we all read for insights and important reports and analysis. Shir, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me, Bassam.
Good to have you, my friend. I am very much looking forward to this episode, especially that it sort of resonates with what a lot of people have been hearing for quite some time, that the Israeli economy is on the verge of collapse. We would like to get a sense from you as to whether this is on the way, on the like literally on the verge of collapse, or it is a bit down the road, if indeed there is a collapse in the picture. So before we get started, I have some questions that are more specific. But is there anything you'd like to share as to the extent to which we are looking at an imminent collapse?
I think that all of us are exposed to a lot of news, mainly propaganda from Israeli media channels, trying to paint a different picture, to tell us that the Israeli economy is on the verge of recovery and that everything is going to be fine for Israel. But I urge us to pay close attention to how exactly they are making the case for it and what arguments they make. They like to use the term resilience a lot, as if resilience is somehow a special resource that only the Israelis have. And if you think about it, it's a very racist idea, as if Jewish Israelis are some kind of superior race who are able to withstand economic hardships better than anyone else, and then they want to market it as a way to recover the economy by selling this kind of resilience to the rest of the world. But once we put our feet firmly on the ground of reality, we see a completely different picture.
All right, I'm going to move on to a few questions, starting with the Israeli budget. But first, if you don't mind, I think the round object that's close to the table is generating sound in front of you. The black, yeah, that's it. Yeah, no, yeah, that's it. It's hitting the table. Yeah,
Oh, okay,
and
sorry.
we can hear it. Okay, um, I'm not gonna edit this out. We don't edit things out unless it's like really really bad. Um, all right, so we are going to start with a question on the Israeli government budget. Can you tell us how is it passed and how come Israel doesn't have a budget for 2026 yet? And I'll go on later with some more detailed questions.
Yeah, the way that the budget works is based on a system that exists in every liberal democracy in the world, by which the parliament is authorized to pass the budget, and this gives the parliament the ability to monitor what the government is doing. But Israel is not a liberal democracy. Israel is not a democracy at all. So we might think that maybe it doesn't matter that Israel is breaking the rules and not passing the budget in an orderly and legal way. But I do think that it does matter, because Israel's trading partners are liberal democracies, and Israel is measured by various criteria, for example, of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Developed Democracies. So if the Israeli government is not able to pass a budget that passes through the parliament, the Israeli Knesset, then it's a very strong signal for the rest of the world that Israel's economy is not working. And normally, according to the law in Israel, when the government fails to pass the budget, the government falls and there's an election. And this is also the situation in most countries in the world. But Israel is supposed to pass the budget for the following year at October at the latest. Now, the budget for 2025, the year we are now, has only been passed in March 2025. So already deep into the year. This means that actually the Israeli government should have fallen in October, and there should have been October 2024, and there should have been elections, but the government is simply breaking the rules. Now, the reason that the government is breaking the rules is not that it is not able to get a majority in the parliament, because the Knesset is very much supporting the genocide. There's a very big majority in the Knesset for the government policy. But when you talk about a budget, you also talk about compromise. You also talk about what's going to be cut out in order to finance the war. And this is the sensitive part, because of course every member of the Israeli Knesset, or not every, but the vast majority of them, they want the Israeli military to continue to pound Gaza and to kill more civilians in Gaza, and also to annex more land and in the West Bank and so on. They support it. But are they also willing to see cuts in health and in education and in transportation? And the answer is no. And every Knesset member represents this or that interest, and they vote against it. So in fact, the budget that Israel has now for the year 2025 was actually cobbled together in March, just after 3 months of ceasefire. This was the ceasefire of early 2025. And based on the idea that there is a ceasefire, the idea was that the economy was expected to recover, and the military costs will be severely cut for the year 2025. And this was how the government managed to get the Knesset to approve it. And they did approve it, although they did call for wide cuts for the year 2026, right? They're postponing the crisis. And so the budget says, okay, 2025 will increase the debt, we'll spend more than we have, and we'll cut the military spending because there's a ceasefire, and things will slowly, gradually, at some point in the future, start to go back to normal. But once the government sent the draft of the budget to the Knesset to discuss it, it immediately broke the ceasefire. And so the Knesset was discussing a budget that is completely detached from reality. And the ceasefire was broken by Israel in March 18th this year. And immediately afterwards, the Ministry of Defense started to spend money without any kind of controls and without any restrictions. So the budget is actually completely detached from reality. And at the end of the year, or actually I should say next year, early next year, the Ministry of Finance has to publish a report that will compare what was the actual approved budget with what money was actually spent. And if the gap is too big, then it has tremendous repercussions on Israel's credit rating and on the interest of the bonds of the debt that Israel has to pay, and on the willingness of international businesses to do business with Israel, and on the currency value of the Israeli currency compared to other currencies. So all these things are very much precarious. Now, again, we are in October. And in October, once again, Israel doesn't have a budget. This time, the government used the excuse that because of Trump's imposed 20-point plan, which I don't want to call it a peace plan and not even a ceasefire, really, but it is something that the Israelis consider to be, yet again, grounds to believe that the military expenditure will be cut, which is an essential requirement to have any kind of meaningful budget, any kind of functioning economic system, only when the reservists will stop serving, and when the Israel's largest import will not be ammunition that is dropped on Gaza. But The problem is, of course, that so Netanyahu is promising that the next budget for 2026 will be proposed soon, but at the same time, Israel is bombing Gaza again. And also, the military is making plans for keeping the reservists in service, not just in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and in Syria and in the West Bank for the foreseeable future. They're not going to be released home according to the military plans. So, once again, we are seeing a situation in which there is actually no realistic plan for a realistic budget. There's going to be some numbers thrown around, but nobody who is seriously no one who seriously understands how the Israeli economy works will take it will believe that this is really the budget.
Okay, how then? How does Israel finance its expenses if all this is the case?
There are several ways by which the Israeli military, the Israeli government is covering its out of control expenses. Partially, it's by increasing taxes, and they did increase the VAT, the value added tax, in order to raise more money, but this barely scratches the surface. Mainly, the biggest way that they are financing themselves is through debt by simply selling the reserves that they have of foreign currency sitting at the Central Bank of Israel, by spending out of control and selling government bonds, even though these government bonds are being rated lower and lower, and they are really on the verge of being junk bonds. And the people who are buying these bonds, I have to say, are not very good speculators. I imagine that the reason that they're buying Israel bonds is probably because of ideological reasons, and they don't really believe that Israel will be able to pay them back for the loan that they're giving Israel. Um, and if somebody, and unfortunately, a lot of municipalities in the United States are also buying Israel bonds, which means that you, Bassam, and your viewers are financing Israel's genocide, and it's going to be at your expense through those bonds. But so the debt is the major issue, but the debt is also taking a lot of secret forms. So this is something that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. That I conducted an investigation of the weapons that Israel is buying, and in 2024, a lot of the weapons that it got from the United States were free, that Biden gave Israel for free. But Trump actually stopped it, and is only giving Israel free weapons to the tune of $3.8 billion a year, which is still more than any other country in the world. But it's a far cry from what Israel is actually importing from the United States, meaning Israel has to buy the rest of the weapons on their own with their own money. And of course, the weapons that are being imported from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, are all financed by the Israeli government, except that they are buying all the weapons on credit. So it's not that they're taking loans through bonds and then using the money to buy weapons, but rather they're telling the arms companies that they will pay them next year. So this creates a secret debt. And this secret debt is another collapse waiting to happen. And in a third secret debt is the way that the Israeli Ministry of Defense is paying the reservists. And we did talk about it in part two of our conversation, where they issue those reserve duty days, where the reservists are paid a lot of money, and it comes theoretically out of the budget of the Ministry of Defense, except that the Ministry of Defense doesn't have any authorization for this budget, and it's just like printing money. So printing money is another way by which governments can create a sort of debt which is secret, because unless of course they announce exactly how much, but because Israel is not revealing how many reservists it has called and how many days they're serving, this is considered to be a military secret, then it's also not revealing how much money is being spent on them. And this is another way that they're cheating the credit agencies and the banks and the international markets, and financing the war and the genocide for another week, for another month. But sooner or later, it must come to an end.
Thanks, Shir. There's a lot that I'd like to discuss, but we are confining this conversation to something close to half an hour. So I'm going to go forward with the questions, and then maybe at the end we can speculate a little bit more. Um, do you have, or are there updated numbers and or indicators about the size of emigration from Israel? And if you can say something about who exactly are the people, not exactly, but who are generally actually the people who are emigrating.
So the very fact that Israel doesn't know how many people are leaving is and for how long and what kind of people are leaving is also another indication that the Israeli public services are falling apart. Because of course there are countries in the world that don't care very much about keeping tabs on the demographics of their own population. You know, in Canada, if you leave the country, they don't stamp your passport, so they don't have any record of how many people left. But Israel is obsessively concerned with how many Jews live and how many non-Jews, how many Palestinians live in the area under its control, how many leave, how many return, if people are still citizens of Israel when they're abroad, if they still have their residency, and so on. So it creates a very complex um, piece of data, and the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics is completely failing to simply collect the data. They don't have the capacity to do it, which I think is a strong indication of what's actually happening in Israel. But there are a lot of estimates and a lot of partial reports, and those reports are saying that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are leaving, but there are also some who are coming in, and overall the balance is negative, and it's not negative enough to lower the population of Israel. This is something we have to understand in terms of, to speak on realistic terms. The rate of growth of the Israeli population is 1.8% every year, and the emigration from Israel is not enough to make this rate of growth negative, of course. But the real question is, who are the people who are leaving? And here the reports are saying we're talking about the educated middle class, about people who are usually young people with families, because those have the strongest motivation to leave. They want to raise their children in a sane place where the children will be safe. And also, these are the people who have the means to leave, because some of them have a second passport, some of them have a possibility to enroll to studies abroad, some of them have job offers abroad, they tend to speak more languages. So the educated middle class, people, professionals with jobs that are in short demand in other countries, those are the ones who are leaving. And of course, this exacerbates the crisis inside Israel, because there is a shortage of doctors, a shortage of engineers, a shortage of programmers. These are really the people who are leaving. And I do want to point out that the Knesset, the Israeli parliament I mentioned before, it has a special department for scientific research. They have researchers on call that the members of Knesset can ask questions to conduct special research for them. And there is a very recent report that just came out by this research center trying to answer the question, how many Israelis are leaving and who are they? And I read this report. It's fascinating. And I hope it will be translated into English as well, where actually they're saying that the emigration wave has started in the year 2020 and then started to accelerate more and more in 2022. And then from 2022 until today, every year, the number of people who leave increases by 50%. Okay, so it's 1,000 in one year, then it's 1,500 in the next year, and then it's 50% more than the next number. So it's really a geometrically exploding line of people leaving, and those are the people who are registered as leaving long term, not just going on vacation, but those who are really shifting their life into another country. And at the same time, the people who are coming into Israel every year is dropping in absolute numbers. And they also did a survey of how many, of what kind of people they are. But this time they did the survey based on their ethnic and religious identity. And they discovered that, well, not surprisingly, people who are new, who haven't been born in Israel or in Palestine, people who came in the last couple of years, are the highest chance to be the ones leaving. They still have some life and connections and maybe a job or and property in another country, so they are the first to leave. But then, if we talk about those who really were born in Palestine and then leave, then it's almost entirely Jews, and very, very few Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are leaving. And I think this speaks not so much to the issue of class and education. It speaks a lot to the issue of politics and ideology, and the idea of sumud, of Palestinians who are not leaving even though there is a serious crisis. But there are a lot of Jews who have lost hope for the future of a Zionist state, and they're leaving because they are disillusioned with this project.
Um, Before we move on, because I have just a couple more questions. Do we? What about information or data about people coming to Israel in the past 2 years to settle, not to just visit? Is there any indication that this has? I mean, naturally, one would think that this is not the best time even to visit, but definitely to decide this is the time I want to settle, at least for the majority of people. Some might do it for ideological reason, specifically at this point, but the majority of people might not. But this is just a conjecture. Is there data on this?
Yes, actually. So the Israeli government has published a lot of statements that they're saying that after October 7, 23, there has been a surge of Jews from all over the world who want to come to Israel to volunteer for military service and to fight to protect the Jewish state. But the data is very clearly saying this is absolutely wrong. And this is not happening. In fact, what is happening is that those who enter by using the law of return, the Israeli law of return, which grants automatic citizenship to any Jew from around the world, or at least anyone who's recognized as a Jew, according to their criteria, the number of people coming in is dropping significantly year after year. Every year it's less than the year before. And these are the people who are coming in to settle. There was a small surge in the number in the year 2015, okay, so 10 years ago. This was after the attacks in France. And then and Netanyahu went to France and said that he's calling on the Jews of France to leave their homes and come to Israel. And some French politicians commented that this is a very anti-Semitic thing to say, and if they would say something like this, like the French Jews should leave their homes and go to some other country, then it would be, of course, anti-Semitic and illegal in France to say something like this. But indeed, there were a few thousand French Jews who came to Israel and used their right as under the law of return, which gives them a bunch of benefits, like, for example, free Hebrew lessons, free rent for a few months, some tax benefits, things like this. And they got the Israeli passport, and then they went back to France. And so now they're also Israeli citizens, but they live in France. And these people are not coming to Israel in any large numbers after October 7, 23, despite what the government wants us to think.
Um, yeah, I have a number of questions actually on this. It's something that we sort of, quote unquote, pontificated about and surmised, that under these circumstances, the question of Israel being a safe haven. I mean, I did that myself, based on some reporting, which honestly, I mean, it was not ubiquitous, but it was not hidden about the extent to which people are now rethinking. Some people are rethinking going to Israel. People who had planned to settle there, similar to the question of, frankly, Syria. After the collapse of the regime in 2024 in December, A lot of Syrians decided to go back to Syria, and of course, this is a very different situation. But as the situation in Syria worsened in terms of security, in terms of the potential promise of an open or a relatively open political system and society, people reconsidered. Uh, is this question, and I'll just stop at this question on the question of people coming in and out of Israel to settle or to visit, is the question of Israel being a safe haven for Jews. Uh, has it changed, and to what extent, if it indeed has changed since October 7th?
I think it has changed on two levels. One, on a more open way, just how you describe it. Israelis who say, we thought Israel is a safe haven for Jews, but after October 7 and the failure of the government to protect its citizens, and the failure of the government and the continued failure of the government to secure a ceasefire and an exchange of hostages and so on, is something that they say, well, this has convinced us that the Zionist project has come to an end. The state of Israel has no future. The people who say this openly are usually in their 70s. And the reason that you see those people in the 70s speaking like this is because they remember that in October 6, 1973, 50 years before the October 7 attack, there was another surprise attack against Israel. And this one also was a moment in which a lot of Israelis didn't know if Israel is going to survive or not. And it was the war of 73. And then after the war, it's a whole generation of young Israelis who said, we are going to make sure that it never happens again. And when it did happen again, then their faith has been broken that it's in their power to do it differently. But the other generation, the younger generations, are not speaking so openly. They're not so keen to say, oh, the Zionist project is over. But I think that they are voting in their feet. And I can see it also voting with their feet, and I see it with my own family even. Family members of mine that are not don't think like me and strongly argue with me about politics and consider themselves Zionists. And then, at some point in the conversation, they say, so how difficult really is it to get a residency in Germany? And what is the rent here? And how is the health insurance working? So, and these kind of, because in the end, they also want to make sure that their children can grow up in a sane environment. And I think this is the main difference between Syria and Israel in this case is the trajectory for the future. The many people who came back to Syria when the Assad regime fell are those who I think believed that now, not that Syria is now a paradise, but it will be better than it is now. There is hope that things will become gradually better, so it makes sense to go back. But if people believe things are going to get gradually worse, then they're going to move in the opposite direction.
Well, just a quick note. In the case of Syria, I mean, that's what people thought early on. A lot of people, actually, even those who don't necessarily care about either regime, the collapsed regime, or as I call it, the withered regime, because it kind of withered, it didn't collapse, and the current regime. And they still decided, this might be a good time to go back, hoping for something better. But even then, of course, that began to trickle down, actually, or began to decrease, at least in terms of, the anecdotal evidence that we have. Now, okay, so let's move on to another topic, which which I would like to get some background on in terms of your research. We've had a number of economic crises in the past in Israel. One in the mid '60s, one in '82. I'm assuming that the one in '82 may or may not have had something to do with the invasion of Lebanon, and it could very well not be the main reason or the only reason. And then one in 2002, which coincides with the second Intifada. And how do we compare these crises? And if there may be more, I mean, feel free to correct me. There may be more, but how do these compare to this crisis, and how, and if they're different, how are they different in terms of severity and causes?
All of these crises that you mentioned were very severe and impacted the standard of living of Israelis. But I think we need to look at the big picture here. The crisis that Israel is undergoing now, in terms of how it affects the standard of living of Israelis, many Israelis would say, well, it's not as bad as it was before. But the difference is that Israeli society has changed and the Israeli economy has changed. As a settler colonial society, Israel cannot afford to be a completely capitalist market. And actually, all the settler colonies, even though today the settler colonies that have stabilized, like North America and Australia, are capitalist neoliberal economies, but they didn't start out this way. They started out with a lot of government control and ownership and collective ownership of land in order to allow the white settlers an advantage over the indigenous population. And the same thing happened in Israel. And this collective ownership of land is something that you might even call socialist, but of course it's socialist for one group and not for the others. And Israel did start as a very strong social democracy for its Jewish population, with very strong welfare and support and so on. And this was a kind of social contract between the state and the people. You will receive support from the government. You will be cared for in times of crisis. But when the state needs you, you will put on the uniform, take the gun, and go and fight and put your life at risk. And this is the social contract that made it possible for the settler economy to be so successful. The settler soldiers who are supported by the state in times of calm, and then become soldiers in times of crisis. But Israel couldn't stay the only social democracy in the West. In fact, it was under a lot of pressure, especially after the crisis of the early 80s that you mentioned, to liberalize the economy and to dismantle the welfare state and to privatize state ownership over a lot of things. And it was a long process, which continues until today, but it is so a 40-year long process of liberalization, neoliberalization, I should say, pauperization of large parts of the population, dismantling the social support network, also for Jews, not just for Palestinians. And this process also eroded the social contract. So if in the years of, in the previous crisis, when there was this economic suffering, but and there was also military crisis, like you mentioned, the Second Intifada, the war, the invasion of Lebanon, still people showed up for military service and were willing to sacrifice. And they also used this kind of language where they said, yeah, we are suffering but economically, but it isn't the name of the nation. It's for the collective Jewish Zionist interest that we suffer now, and later it will be better. But if the social contract is broken, and if you have a lot of Israelis who say, why should I sacrifice for the state that has done nothing for me? Then the crisis becomes much more, it cuts much deeper into the social fabric. And you know, one of the city that was hit the hardest on October 7 was Sderot, which is a city only 4 kilometers from Gaza. And it's a city where the majority of the people live under the poverty line. And I lived in this city for a year. And when just before I was supposed to join the military, and the young kids that I worked with there, like the teenagers, who told me, we have no intention of becoming soldiers for Israel, because the state of Israel has condemned us to poverty, so why should we sacrifice our lives for the state of Israel? And they helped me. I'm grateful to them. They really helped me make the decision not to serve in the military myself. So I think this is the part of the Israeli society that shows how, and there are many parts like this, that show how the social fabric of Israeli Jewish society is eroded. And so the crisis that we're seeing now is convincing people that no, there is no reason that they will sacrifice their own well-being and the well-being of their family and their children in the name of supporting the Zionist interest. It's actually a much more rational choice to pack their bags and leave.
Thanks, Shir. Can I ask you just a specific question before moving on? What do you mean by when we talk about economic collapse? Like, what does that mean? Uh, a lot of people who are looking at this situation in Israel, or frankly at anything similar, if you can just tell us from a political economy perspective, what first, and then how it applies to Israel. What is economic collapse, and how can one identify economic collapse as opposed to a serious recession or regression?
Yeah, crisis is the threat of collapse. It's not the actual collapse. An actual collapse can be a biological thing. Like, for example, if a society doesn't have enough drinking water, enough food, and the society, the economy is falling apart because of this. And of course, this is not the case that we're talking about. We're talking about a collapse, an economic collapse in the sense of the capitalist economic system. Capitalism is built on the idea of constant growth. Now, if you think there is a certain recession which will last maybe a year or a little bit more, uh, but later things will pick up again, then people are willing to keep the institutions in place, even though there is no growth at this moment, because they believe the growth will come in later. But if people believe that there is no growth around the corner, to quote the famous statement by President Hoover, who said, "Recovery is around the corner." Yeah, and Netanyahu has said exactly the same thing when he said, "We are a pace away from total victory in Gaza." And of course, a victory that has never come and will never come. But when people don't believe it anymore, then we are talking not about a crisis but about a collapse, because no one will buy a house if they think that the value of the house is going to drop because the housing prices are in a long-term decline. No one will want to start a family if they think that their children will have a bad life in this country. No one, the number of students that are enrolling to Israeli universities is actually not catching up to the growth of the population. So every year, normally the number of students enrolling to the first years at university is increasing by at least 1.8%, which is the growth of the population altogether. But now it's less. So the Israeli population, so people don't believe that there's any point in getting higher education, or maybe they don't have the means to get it. So they're not building for the future. They're not investing in their own education. This is really the beginning of collapse, when people really don't see how they are going to have a future. And if the government is hiding the debt, what I said before, and not acknowledging it, then they know that they are living on borrowed time. They know that this lie is going to be exposed. It's not so hard to find out that Israel is spending more money than they have, and they're only lying to the public and to themselves for a few months before it all becomes uncovered. So this kind of policy is also very, very short-term policy. So they also don't believe in the future. Once in a while, you can really see the Israeli officials at the Ministry of Finance who are crying out and saying that this is a recipe for disaster. And then some of them have even stepped down and left their jobs because, as an act of protest, but also as an act of despair. Because the Minister of Finance in Israel is Bezalel Smotrich, the far right settler who called himself a fascist and a homophobe. And when he was asked about the budget, he said, "Well, it's a war budget, and God will give us victory." So that's it. We're not going to talk about economics. We're going to talk about God, and I think this is really why I'm using the word collapse and not just crisis.
Okay. So basically, it's different than that situation that you describe is different than Syria's balance of payment crisis in '86. Is different than the debt question in Argentina in 2000 and Greece, I guess, in 2007. Uh, and these are at least what comes to mind in terms of comparative examples that I and some people are aware of. Many people maybe. Um, I want to ask you a question about what you just said earlier. I mean, I wanted to ask you about this, but you said it. You said something about Smotrich and God, which, in my view, I mean, which might be viewed as just ideology, right? You can say God all you want. How does ideology or a way of thinking, call it what you will, whether it's Zionism or something else, how does it mitigate those crises? And does it do that in a way that is a form of a show of force, or does it do that at its own peril? In other words, if you keep saying that, is it a function of how you're going to be able to handle things regardless? Or is it potentially an assertion that is spiraling down into the abyss in a really horrible manner? Or is it a part of both? I mean, how do we see ideology play a role here? Not just for people like Smotrich who are saying that, but a broader political class or even the majority of Israelis.
Smotrich represents a very small fragment of the Israeli population. This kind of religion that he has is a mix between nationalism, Zionism, and Judaism, which is actually almost non existent outside of Israel. And within Israel, it represents about 7% of the population, of the Jewish population. So it's a minority faction because it's very messianic and very cult-like in its ideology, and also really built on an idea on the value of self-sacrifice and the value of revenge. One of the fathers of the Israeli hostages that were taken on October 7, one of them belongs to this branch of religion. And he gave an interview after October 7 and said that he doesn't expect the government to try to release his son because he sees it as the sacrifice that Israel must do in order to liberate the land of Gaza and conquer it. So he wants his son to die. This, and the thing is that this interview was then broadcast on Israeli television, and the responses in Israeli society were disgust and horror and fear. I think it contributed to the feeling of despair that the vast majority of Israelis feel because they don't share this idea that you should sacrifice your own child. And so really, this is an ideology, yes, but it's an ideology that doesn't really unify the Israeli public. Of course, most Israelis, most Jewish Israelis, they do have ideology that supports Zionism, that supports also, I would say that those Jewish Israelis that call themselves secular are not really as secular as they pretend to be. The famous joke that the Zionists don't believe in God, but they believe that God gave them the land of Israel. And this is but the idea is that they want a settler colonial state in which they are the master race, in which they have privilege and comfort and wealth. And this is not what Smotrich is talking about. Smotrich is talking about spilling our blood for the glory of God in the holy war. And this is something that might work in a fascist state, but it doesn't work in a deeply unequal and fragmented society as the Israeli society, as a colonial society is.
And just a very quick comment. So, in times of war, do these groups or individuals like Smotrich, who are fringe statistically to an extent, in times of war, does does this get fused with a broader section of the population? Is this what we're witnessing, at least according to the polls, in terms of supporting what these very same individuals are leading? And if that's the case, does this mean right after things settle down? Because what people don't sometimes don't realize, sometimes, right? I don't want to, make a too broad a statement. Is that even if the genocide ends in quotation marks, it's not like the genocide or the dehumanization and dispossession and ethnic cleansing started on October 7th, right? And it's not going to end when the genocide ends, also in quotation marks. There's a period before October 7th, and there will be a period after the, I call it the subsiding of the genocide, that where things are going to go back to normal. And the normal is a horrific state of being, which is one of my main critiques of everyone that is now, so many people, not everyone, who are critical of the genocide, as though all we need is a return to no genocide, which is actually a horrific, repulsive type of um, life for Palestinians under military occupation, which guarantees apartheid and ethnic cleansing, and as we are seeing in the West Bank, the gradual takeover of more and more land and splitting uh, cities and towns as a result of the roads and so on. So is this the case that during war we're seeing more congruence, and then we're likely to see a bit more, maybe a lot more conflict? And that's the last question.
Actually, I think this question, which is so nuanced and important and layered, is the groundwork for our next conversation about the delusional state of the Israeli society.
All right,
Because
let's. I
yeah,
won't let you struggle with trying to not to answer, so we'll leave it to then, which would be our last episode. And if I am permitted to lie to our audience and say, yes, it's 5 episodes, but we we might add another. I don't know. We'll see if you're open to it. But yes, I would like to discuss this. And but at this point, this conversation about the collapse, I think, is has been very insightful, and I felt that. I learned more about the conditions that would spell collapse, or portend collapse, as opposed to just thinking about it as a generic potential imminent uh, happening or or eventuality. Shukran, thank you, Shir, for your words and analysis, and I hope that we continue to speak with you. And I would like to alert people who are watching that we are also working with Sheer, even though Sheer is doing the work, to produce a textual document for each of the episodes that will accompany the episode and produce, more sort of specific analysis and documentations and citations that will help others continue to do research or expand on the research and the work that's been done. So look out for that. It will be published on jadaliyya.com. And of course, if people do not know how to pronounce Jadaliyya, it's Jadaliyya. And we will actually add the URL next time online, if not this time at the end of the episode. Thanks again, Shir. Any last words?
thank you very much for having me. Looking forward
أهلا
for our
وس
next conversation.
أهلا وسهلا. We'll see you soon. Take care.